Hey everyone, welcome to Happy to See Me, the podcast that puts the spotlight on the overlooked and underestimated. I'm Erika Casupanan, I am your host, and this week I am speaking with Ruby Veridiano. But first, I love to start each episode talking about something I was happy to see this week. And this week, I'm going to remind everyone of something that I was happy to see last year in a previous episode. But since I am speaking to Ruby about sustainable fashion, I think it makes sense to bring it up in this episode as well. So what I am happy to see, or happy to remind you of, is the not-for-profit News Circles here in Toronto. So last year, I did some work with News Circles. It's this not-for-profit that provides clothing and skills training to new Canadians and equity-deserving individuals. And I did some work to support their skills training programs. News Circles has a really awesome clothing donation program where you donate your clothing and it gets put into this shop where equity deserving individuals in the community are able to book appointments and shop for free to get new clothing items for their family in a very dignified way. And I think this is so important because I know that we love to do a spring clean, love to do a purge, and want to donate our clothes in a way that hopefully they get reused and isn't just contributing to a landfill. And through donating to an organization like News Circles, you know that your clothing is now being reused and affecting somebody who is directly in your community. So if you are in Toronto, I suggest you check out News Circles as an option for clothing donation. And if you are not in Toronto, have a look at the not-for-profits in your area because there could be something similar set up where you know that the items that you once loved can now be loved by somebody in your community. So that is what I was happy to see this week. Now, I'm very excited for this conversation with Ruby Veridiano. Ruby is a sustainable fashion storyteller, educator, speaker, and communications consultant. Ruby is focused on connecting the dots between women's empowerment and sustainable fashion, as well as promoting diversity and inclusion within the fashion industry. She is also a fellow Filipina immigrant to North America, so we talk about how clothing when we were younger helped us to figure out our identities. Ruby also demystifies what it means for fashion to be sustainable, and she provides tips on how to dress more sustainably today. So let us get into it. This is my interview with Ruby Veridiano, and I hope you enjoy it. It's always nice to have a fellow Filipina on the podcast with me. And you also immigrated from the Philippines, correct?
I did. I grew up as a kid in Manila and moved to California when I was about 10 years old.
Wow. So you've had memories of both the Philippines and of the US then?
Absolutely. Speak the language still quite fluently. Actually surprised my parents when we went home like a few years later. They were like, "Oh, you still speak the language?" And I'm like, "I do." So yeah, a lot of formative memories, and I've gotten a chance to go back as an adult to live there for a chunk of time as well. So definitely have a lot of vivid memories of Manila and the Philippines.
Ooh, I'm very jealous. I actually haven't had the chance to go back since I was born. But every time I have a guest on the show, I always feel, oh, I really need to make that happen sooner rather than later.
It'll come at the perfect time.
So now you are in the US and you are a sustainable fashion storyteller. So can you explain what that is?
Yes, I'm glad you asked because I know that storyteller is a big word, but it really is the best way to encompass all the different ways that I tell stories. At the base, I'm a writer and I'm also a former journalist. So I do a lot of content creation to educate people about sustainable fashion. And then I also do a lot of speaking engagements around the topic. I sometimes do, I also sometimes work as an event MC for sustainable fashion conferences. And as a storyteller, I also work to tell other people's stories. I'm a communications consultant. So I have the honor and the privilege of working with fashion startups and industry associations that are looking to make a difference in the industry and helping them amplify their stories so that their impact can be accelerated.
I love that. So many people who listen to the podcast know that I love vintage shopping, thrift shopping, shopping from local designers when I can. So I have so many questions that I can't wait to dig into with you. But first, I want to know how you got started working in sustainable fashion. So I had read that you had, as you said before, moved to the US from the Philippines as a kid, and that fashion helped you to quote unquote be American. So what does that mean?
Well, I've always been naturally interested in fashion. I think it's really kind of, I'm blaming the maternal side of my family. My mom was still is a very stylish woman, and she inherited that from my grandmother. You know, the maternal side of my family has always been very elegant and graceful. And I've just always grown up around this appreciation for fashion, and just not necessarily from a vanity perspective, but really about dressing up for the occasion of life and really having that sense of elegance. So fashion has always been a lens that I see the world through. And I remember coming over to the US. As you might know, even though you've not been to the Philippines since you were born, the weather is very different, right?
Yes.
You know, in California and where you are in Toronto, there are seasons. And in the Philippines, it's just hot all year long. It's either hot or it's wet. And so I remember thinking that when I got to the US, I had to be very strategic about my clothes so that I could be warm. So that was how it was started. I was like, okay, how do I dress for the new weather? And then I was going to school. Again, because I've always been a writer, I kept this journal, and I like look back at it. I have like this journal from when I was 10 years old, and I literally documented my assimilation experience through what I was wearing. I think I was just very conscious of the fact that like I wanted to look American. I wanted to embody this new culture. And I remember thinking that, gosh, you know, Converse shoes, that is like
Hmm.
the epitome of American style. And at the time, my parents couldn't afford to get me real Converses. But even though I got like kind of the imitation Converse shoes, I remember getting my first pair and thinking, okay, it's official. I'm an
Yeah.
American girl. And I was able to, you know, pair it with overalls and all of these kind of quintessential American staples. And I think it just helped me to understand how I could fit in, and also understand how I could define my new life through the clothes that I was wearing. And it was just something that I was naturally interested in, you know, pop culture. I remember the era of baggy pants and baby tees, and just having a lot of fun with that. And yeah, that's how I kind of like got to lean into a new American identity.
Oh, I can relate to so much of that. I also had a really fashionable grandmother. So, shout out to the fashionable Lolas. And if there's any
Yes,
non Filipinos listening, Lola is like what we call our grandmother in Tagalog. And then, yeah, I also remember I grew up wearing a lot of secondhand clothes and then going to
same.
the thrift stores and trying to figure out, okay, how can I make this work? And there's like a resourcefulness that you develop through learning to shop like that when you're a kid.
Exactly. And actually, that is a sustainable way to shop. You know, like we'll talk about that later. But I think that there was a lot of things that were actually really natural in our culture that is actually considered a sustainable practice. But I didn't realize it until later on. But absolutely, like growing up, buying things secondhand, that was, you know, our jam when I was a kid, and getting to score on all of these new fashion items in that way.
Oh yeah, there's totally so many things where probably in the moment as a kid you're like, "Oh, why am I shopping like this?" But then in hindsight you realize, "Oh, this is actually a great way to be shopping."
Yeah.
For you when it came to fashion, so you used fashion to help you in terms of forming your identity. Of course, clothing is something that we all need. Was there a moment when you realized that fashion was more than simply the garment that was in your hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think that number one, fashion is not just a head to toe look. So I'm going to answer that in two ways. The number one, the first way is I think that fashion is also about style. It's really about dressing how you want to be addressed, right? Like before you even say a word, you walk into a room and this is how you introduce yourself, you know? And I think that as a Filipino who has lived and worked around the world in different countries, sometimes I'm coming across someone who's meeting a Filipino for the first time, and I've always been, I think, conscious of that and wanting to not only represent myself, but represent my family and my community, and just wanting to really have an intentional style to be able to introduce myself before I even said a word, especially if I'm in a country where I don't even speak the language. And then the second way that I'm going to answer that is that I didn't start my career in fashion. I actually started my career in the nonprofit sector. I've always been like an artist activist, really involved with a lot of social issues, and really have always had this passion to create positive change in the world. And the reason why I even got into sustainable fashion in the first place was I started to learn more about the fashion supply chain, and understanding that, gosh, before this garment arrives as a packaged, product in my hands or at the store, it goes through this incredible journey that involves hundreds of human hands across the supply chain. And, that supply chain journey, it goes from being a raw material, which is, something that farmers produce. And then it goes through the manufacturing process, which again, involves hundreds of pairs of human hands, a lot of them women. The garment worker population, there's millions of them employed by all of these manufacturing companies throughout the world. And 80% of that population are actually women. And in my early days as a writer and as an artist activist, I'd always been really passionate about championing women's voices. So when I realized that women also had, such a huge involvement in the production of our clothes, and that they were kind of the hidden faces of it, I realized, okay, this is just more than a garment. There's more to this than just the end product. There's a whole journey that it goes through, and that there's a whole story behind that. So I think that that's really what prompted me to dedicate my career to this space and wanting to ensure that the entire story behind the scenes, pun intended, is told.
Yeah, with your work as a writer, work in not-for-profit, it's clear that you've always wanted to make some type of an impact, and then fashion became the vehicle for you to do that. When did you first get tipped off about the fashion supply chain and all of the faces that were unseen in it?
Well, okay. So again, like I didn't start my career in fashion, right? I started my career in the nonprofit sector and NGOs. I got a chance to work on the field with a lot of young women. So I've always kind of had this community aspect and this community building lens through the work that I do. And then I remember I ended up working at a fashion company completely by accident. I mean, not accident, but it wasn't my intention to necessarily go into the fashion industry because I didn't know how my skill sets would be relatable. A lot of the fashion jobs that I was seeing were in merchandising and design and in very traditional kind of fashion marketing type of roles that I was like, I don't know how to enter that space. But when I got a temp job one summer at this fashion company, I realized they had a corporate social responsibility department. And that means a lot of different things depending on what company, but it kind of opened this rabbit hole for me where I was like, oh, that's a thing. That's a space in the industry that I might be able to follow and to think about. So I started following the breadcrumbs and decided that it would be time for me to go back to graduate school because I started realizing that graduate programs were tackling this idea of, at the time, was called ethical fashion. There's a lot of different kind of like iterations of the name, but at the time a lot of what I was finding in my research was called ethical fashion. And so I decided to apply for graduate school. It was at the American University of Paris. I got into graduate school, so 3 months later I moved to Paris, and during graduate school I got a chance to learn more about this ethical fashion topic, and my professors there introduced us to a lot of different material, including material about cotton farmers who were, really in very desperate situations because they were, not being paid fairly, and then going on to the garment worker journey. Then there was this nonprofit organization called Remake that created a video called Made in Cambodia, and it was featuring human stories of women that work in factories. And one of the stories really hit hard for me. It was this woman who was saying that one of her greatest fears was that her daughter, who was a teenager at the time, would have to drop out of school to help her out in the factories. And that moment was when I was like, oh my goodness. In the nonprofit sector, I was working in education and I was championing girls' education. And so when I saw that girls' education and fashion were intersecting in this way because a mother was scared that her daughter was going to have to give up her schooling to help her out in the factory to make the clothes that we wear, it just all kind of made sense to me. And that's what crystallized my commitment to the fact that, my goodness, sustainable fashion is actually a women and girls issue as well. So that's why, like, I've been dedicated to this cause and just wanting to educate people about it so that we can make more conscious decisions about what we wear and how we wear them.
I feel like there are so many great lessons in what you just shared. I think one, even if you are unsure if you have transferable skills, if you are passionate about something, there is some way that you can take whatever you do to be able to contribute and to make that a part of your life. And I think the second is, when, at least for me, when I think of sustainable fashion, it's really easy to think about the environment and the materials and not being wasteful, which I think, of course, are part of sustainable fashion. But it's really easy to overlook the human cost when it comes to fashion as well. So I want to ask you more and, pick at your expertise when it comes to sustainable fashion. First, can you explain what does it mean for fashion to be sustainable?
Yes, oh, such a big question. I'll try to unpack it as best as I can. But you hit it right on the head in that a lot of people, when they think about sustainability, the first thought goes to the planet, which is completely true. However, the planet does house people, right? And so the planet and the people intersect, and that needs to be a big part of the sustainability conversation. So the first part is, the fashion supply chain is a very extractive and polluting industry as it stands right now. It requires a lot of raw materials. It requires a lot of water and chemicals, and the way that clothes are being made right now is very harmful to the planet. So one part of sustainable fashion is really from an industry perspective, how do we create and produce clothes in a way that's responsible and not only mitigating the harm to the environment, but actually restoring it as well, right? So it's not just about lessening the things that we take from the environment, but also how do we create so that we can put back and restore the things that we take from it. So that's the environmental side. And then again, as I mentioned, so many people are impacted by the fashion supply chain. It's a human rights issue. I think that a lot of people have heard about stories about sweatshops, which has been kind of things that were really big in the 80s and in the 90s, and it's still really big now. But I think that even though this has been an issue that's been going on for hundreds of years, I think that there's a new consciousness that's rising up because of all of the other sustainable fashion leaders and advocates that are in the space that have really been able to make this issue more visible. I think post-COVID too, I think that has been a really big shift as well in terms of our awareness of things happening. So it's really about, yeah, like as we think about how we create clothes and produce clothes in a more responsible way, we have to think about both the planet and the people that are involved, and how do we create systems of care so that everybody is well taken care of and not at the expense of, sometimes we think, oh, that's a $5 shirt. That $5 shirt, somebody paid for that, whether
Mm-hmm.
it was through cheap labor or whatnot, right? So we have to think consciously about the decisions that we're making because it's all connected.
Yeah, that's such a powerful way to put it. When you find an item that seems like a great deal, somebody or something is absorbing the cost. It might not be
Exactly.
you, but there's somebody that's absorbing it. In your years as a sustainable fashion storyteller, you've done so much to raise awareness and educate people. What are some of the common myths or, common misconceptions that people have when it comes to sustainable fashion?
I remember once I told somebody that I worked in sustainable fashion. They were like, I know exactly what that is. It's about turning recycled plastic bottles into clothes. And I'm like, well, that's one part of it, but that is not the only part of it, right? And I think that has material innovation like that is really important. But again, it's not the end all be all. It's a more complex and nuanced topic that requires a lot of unpacking. The other myth is that people think that in order to participate in sustainable fashion, that the only way they can do that is to buy sustainable brands. You cannot fix fire with fire, right? It's
Yeah.
not about fixing something by buying more of something else. Yes, it's helpful to shop more sustainable brands. That's definitely very helpful. But I think it's really about not just buying from responsible brands, but just having responsible buying habits in general. So, for example, a lot of times people buy things and they don't actually really need it, or they'll buy something and they only wear it once. Those are both, those are examples of very wasteful consumption. I think that sustainable fashion is a lot more than just buying clothes. It's really about how do we have healthy habits. It's kind of like when we eat, right? Like it's like fashion. There's a lot of actually parallels between sustainable fashion and sustainable food, and it's about how do we make sure that we are making the healthiest choices, not only for ourselves but for the planet. So, I think for me, when it comes to the consumer side, it's not just about buying sustainable brands, but number one, are you buying something that's going to last you a long time? Is it something that you can commit to keeping in your closet? Can you buy it secondhand instead? Because we have made enough things to last us lifetimes. So I personally think that buying secondhand is one of the best ways to shop sustainably. And I know that in different countries, there are stigmas about buying secondhand, but I think that like sometimes these secondhand items still have a lot of life in them, so that the more that we are able to normalize and actually make it sexy to, reuse an item, that's actually a more responsible way for us to consume more responsibly. And then also, maybe you don't have to buy anything at all. Maybe it's about swapping things with your friends or your family members, which again, as Filipinos, we've always done that. I've grown up with a lot of cousins. Me and my cousins have always swapped clothes throughout our lifetime as we started growing up and growing out of our clothes. So I think that there's a lot of different habits that can be put into place to allow us to shop more sustainably. So yeah, I think that those are some of the common myths is like, oh, in order to participate in sustainable fashion, I can only buy sustainable fashion brands. And that's just simply not true.
For sure. And I feel with a lot of sustainable fashion brands, of course, if I can and I need to, I try to buy a sustainable fashion brand. At the same time, there's part of me that still carries a level of skepticism where I wonder, okay, is this truly sustainable or is this just marketing?
Yeah.
And owning this, does this actually help the planet or does it just lessen the harm, if that makes sense?
Yeah, because if no matter what, whether when you're producing new, there's always an impact, right? So, there's really it's really hard to make something fully sustainable, but one rule of thumb is to number one, buying from smaller brands means that they have more control over their supply chain, so it's easier for them to track how things are made. So that's, when you're able to buy local and buying from smaller brands, that's always a good idea. But then also there are ways to check. There is an app that I recommend called Good on You, and they review a lot of big and small and medium sized brands, and you can check if the brand that you are considering is listed on there, and you can see if they've reviewed them.
Ooh, good tip. And I think the other thing is a lot of the times brands that say that they are producing things sustainably, they tend to be more expensive and it creates this misconception that you need a certain economic level to be able to access sustainable brands.
Exactly. That is one of the other fashion or sustainable fashion myths is that like, one of the questions that go around is like, is it elitist? Because if it is all only about buying sustainable brands, who can actually participate in it? Which is why I say it's more about habits, because we need to democratize the idea of being able to consume more responsibly.
Oh, yeah. And as you said, there's enough stuff on the planet. If we are just exchanging it between ourselves, we would be fine for the rest of our lifetimes with what we already have.
Yes, absolutely.
So I've read about the circular model of fashion. So can you explain what that is?
Yes. So right now, the common model in which the way that not just fashion, but really most industries, like all consumer goods, even like cars and stuff, right? They operate on a linear model. Linear meaning, okay, we take the resources, we make them, and then take, make, and waste, right? Like it doesn't really have a way to come back to the planet or a way to get reused, right? When it comes to clothes, you take a brand new material from raw, fibers, you make it, and then there's not really a responsible or a good way to dispose of them, which is why we have so many clothes ending up in landfills, right? And then the landfills aren't just in our own countries, they're actually infiltrating countries like Ghana, who is one of the largest importers of secondhand clothes, and it's completely polluting their environment because they're getting such an overwhelming intake of all of these clothes that are no longer wanted, right? So that is a linear model. If there's no way to dispose of the item responsibly or to put it back into the system, that is a linear model. So the circular model disrupts that by saying, okay, once a consumer is done with the item that they're using, instead of throwing it away or, putting it into a landfill, can we find a way to take it back and either A, use materials that will naturally compost? There are some products that do that. Or can we set up a take back program where we reintroduce the item either as a refurbished product and resell it again? Or can we take the material and reintroduce it back into the production cycle and make something new out of it? That is circular. So instead of it going into a landfill or going into the waste, it goes right back into the system so that it could be reused again, so that that material continues to have a second, third, and fourth life. Admittedly, circularity is something that's really hard to do because we have a massive, fashion supply chain that has it's kind of like an eight-headed monster. But I think that there are solutions that are being scaled right now. And I'm quite hopeful and optimistic that there's enough science and there's enough experts out there that can scale this circular model, and that hopefully us as consumers can have the systems in place so that we are able to dispose of our clothes more responsibly, and also donating them more responsibly as well.
Yeah, it's true. There's so many things we can do as consumers. At the same time, we're kind of limited by what the system allows for us. And I can't help but continue to think about the story you told earlier about the mom being worried that the daughter needs to be pulled out of school in order to work in the factories. A circular model of fashion, in theory, could prevent those types of situations from happening. Is that correct?
Well, I think that there's a circular model that I think that that's a little bit separate. What we need to also do, in addition to creating these circular models, is that we also create systems of care for garment workers so that they're paid fairly, right? I think the biggest thing is that there are a lot of there's labor exploitation happening, and the crazy thing about the manufacturing world is that manufacturing companies or manufacturing countries are considered to be the largest manufacturing countries are in Asia, right? In places like the Philippines and China and Cambodia and Bangladesh. So I think that it's not a silver bullet. There's not one solution. There are many levers that need to be pulled in order to make fashion more responsible. Circularity is one way. And then another way is making sure that we are creating systems of care, as I said, so that garment workers are actually paid in a fair way so that they can lift themselves out of poverty instead of staying in poverty. Right now, a lot of garment workers make just enough to live check to check, and that's not necessarily improving their lives. It's just helping them, it's just kind of helping them stay in the same place without room for growth or advancement. So what a lot of companies are doing, and I'm hoping that this continues to expand, is that they're creating partnerships with manufacturers so that there are programs to help care for the garment workers in other ways, like in the same way that we get benefits packages, right? When we go into jobs, that system also needs to be in place for garment workers so that they can actually lift themselves out of poverty and have the opportunity to nurture the next generation with more opportunities.
Oh, yeah, it has to be a big systemic shift in order to help
Exactly.
everybody.
Yeah, and I want to add that as I said, there's a lot of levers that need to be pulled. There's definitely a lot of things that brands can do, that manufacturers can do, that governments can do, but consumers also have a role to play in it. Like all of us, it's a all interconnected system that feeds each other, and consumers have a large part in ensuring that we are demanding accountability because it does matter. It becomes part of the decision making, brands listen to consumers. They listen to consumers' concerns. And the more that there's evidence of consumers actually caring about these things, then it then becomes a priority, because then it's a reputational risk, right? Like, as a brand, all you want to do is protect your reputation. And in order to protect your reputation, you need to make sure that your stakeholders are happy, which includes your consumers. So consumers have a large part to play in not only educating themselves, but educating themselves to a level where they can interrogate the system and demand more.
In terms of consumers, and in particular in terms of social media, have you seen social media advocacy efforts work from consumers in terms of applying pressure to brands?
Absolutely. Like, you don't have to have a million followers to make a difference. Like, even if you have like 2 or 20 followers, I think that when you're studying social media metrics, right? What I learned, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, so I mean, I work in communications, but this is not might not necessarily be my area of expertise. But I remember collaborating with my PR colleague, and they were tracking, and I think you worked in communications as well, so you might know a little bit
Yes.
about this. But there's a way to track consumer sentiment or audience sentiment through data points, right? And so there are certain keywords that get tracked, or keywords that show up in these kind of like, sentiments of like what consumers are thinking or whatnot. So even if you have 2 followers, you become a data point in that kind of evaluation and analysis of like, okay, what are consumers thinking right now? What are consumers feeling? What are their demands? And that actually does play into a part of like the decision making that brands have in regards to, okay, well, we need to communicate better then, right? But then in order for you to communicate better, you actually have to do the work to prove that the communication that you are sharing is actually has some basis. Because now with social media, it's also a lot easier to find information. Everyone can be a journalist if they wanted to, because the internet has so much information and you can track everything. And I think that because of that, the veil has been lifted a little bit, right? Like, there are a lot of coordinated campaigns that have really shifted the conversation, because consumers are going into brand social media accounts to say, hey, we want to know, are you paying your workers? We want to know, like, is this sustainability claim, does it hold like actual truth? And if so, what is your source of truth? So all of those things matter when it comes to a company wanting to make sure that they are, protecting their reputation and ensuring customer loyalty.
Yes. And it's so nice with social media that as consumers, we have the opportunity to challenge brands a bit, or to hold them accountable, and to assure that what their actions are matching what they're saying in terms of their values, and in terms of how they're describing what they're doing to contribute to sustainability.
Yeah. And I will say, having worked in the industry side as well, even though there are a lot of brands who are potentially like, kind of known as the culprits of bad fashion or fast fashion, there are still amazing sustainability leaders within those companies that are working really hard to turn it around. And those efforts are genuine. So it's not like a black and white conversation. I'm realizing it's not like as simple as that's a bad brand. And yes, there's definitely a lot of improvements that can be made, but I'm also recognizing that there are humans working within those systems that are actively trying to change it. I've met really genuine people with really amazing intentions who work at, more controversial brands,
Mhm.
but I know that they are working within the system to try and change and move it in a different direction.
For sure, for sure. You can't paint everything with just one brush. Even with the outfit that I'm wearing right now, for anyone who's just listening to the audio version, I purposely wore a pattern blouse that's from one of my favorite vintage stores in Toronto. And then I'm wearing a vest that I bought from Shein for a Halloween costume a few years ago. And I don't know, even though I know that there's nothing wrong with buying from Shein, I still feel like, ooh, a little guilty. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, all I can do now is continue to wear this because I have it.
Yeah.
So it's like buying an item from like a Zara or an H&M is not inherently bad. It's just making sure you're actually using the item if you have it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to ask you more about social media because I feel on TikTok in particular, there is so much about fashion and trends that move really quickly. There's always some viral item that you need to buy that everybody's buying on TikTok, or so many fashion aesthetics are being named, like the mob wife or the coastal grandpa. And at the same time, I also see a lot of people thrifting on TikTok. So what is something that you see that is good for sustainable fashion that's coming out of social media? And what's something that you see that might not be so good?
Yeah, well, I think social media is definitely a powerful vehicle in terms of campaigning. I think that it is, again, like as we talked to earlier about consumers being able to actually respond to brands directly and having that direct feedback. That is really great way to kind of create that wave of education. And I think that social media has really given ideas like sustainable fashion a platform to spread and disseminate and actually reach people from all corners of the globe. However, it does also fuel a lot of unnecessary consumption, right? So you really have to have a balance between the two. And I think that what I really encourage the most is, okay, like if there's a new style that's coming out, number one, is it actually true to your own style? Is it just a trend or a fad, or is it actually something that makes sense for you and your personality? I think that we all need to do a lot of work in really understanding who we are and what we stand for, and aspire to be intentional about expressing our personality and our values through everything that we do, including what we wear, what we eat, what we support, what we spend our money on, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And so I think that it's very tempting to see something new and to buy it. And social media definitely makes it a lot easier to buy at a click of a button. However, I really encourage folks to remain vigilant. And if you do like a look, like, is there a way for you to not necessarily buy a new item, but to remix what you already have in your closet? You like mob wife or coastal grandma, you've got probably a grandma with those accessories and those items. So maybe instead of buying something new, see if there's an opportunity to source secondhand, source from, people that you already know. And it's fun to play around with style. Like I definitely don't want, I want to make sure that we keep fashion really fun, because that's the whole point of it. Fashion is about making beautiful things and expressing ourselves, but it doesn't have to be at the expense of, exploiting the people or the planet along with it. So if you see a new style, can you stop for a moment and just think, hey, can I figure out how to recreate this look with something that I already have, or something that maybe I have access to within my own family or my community?
Yes, I love that. And I want to ask you about some practical tips for people who are still interested in fashion, still want to have fun, but want to approach it more sustainably.
Yeah.
So, what are some mistakes that people might be making when they're approaching fashion sustainably that could be easy things to fix now?
Yeah, so I think that I want to first start off by sharing a quote by this zero waste chef. Again, there's a lot of parallels between fashion and food, and I might mess this up, but she had said something like, we don't need a million people doing sustainability or zero waste perfectly. We need a million people doing it imperfectly. Right? Like, so you don't have to get it all perfect. There's no perfect way to be sustainable, but what matters is that we all try and move the needle just a little bit. So one rule that I really like to share that comes from a woman called Livia Firth. She started an organization called Eco Age, and she popularized this idea that the 30 wear rule. So when you're buying something, especially if it's new, you got to ask yourself, could I actually see myself wearing this at least 30 times? That's a really great filter for being able to actually understand, like, okay, does this actually have usability and repeated use in my closet, or is it going to be wasteful? So that's the number one thing. Is like, can I employ the 30 wear rule? If I can commit to wearing it 30 wears, in its lifetime, then this is likely a safe purchase. Second, you really just want to buy what you really love. Okay, like, okay, maybe it's not something you'll wear 30 times, but do you really love it? And can you actually see yourself keeping it and valuing it for a long time? Can you see yourself passing it on to somebody? Is it an heirloom item? When you really buy only what you love, you are creating an intentional wardrobe instead of a wasteful wardrobe. So those are the two things. And then the third thing is, like, again, can you buy it secondhand? Is this something that I can just get instead of buying it new? Can I thrift this? Because that is a really easy way to, make sustainable fashion accessible. In terms of price point and in terms of accessibility.
So we also know that right now, everything is really expensive. And the reality for a lot of people is fast fashion is what they have access to. So what are some things that people should consider if they are purchasing fast fashion?
If they're purchasing fast fashion, I really recommend going with basics, right? Like, basic wears like that you can wear as a capsule wardrobe piece. Capsule meaning there like, 5 or 6 items that you're going to wear a lot. Like a pair of jeans, you're probably going to wear those pair of jeans like multiple times. So maybe instead of buying like a bunch of random things, can you be more strategic about building a capsule wardrobe that would, for example, this leather vest that you have, a lot of people have like a black leather jacket. That is an example of a piece that will probably get a lot of wear because you can mix and match it. I want people to normalize re-wearing their clothes. I think that the other thing about social media is that people feel that if they've worn it once in a picture that they can't wear it again, or it's like a cardinal sin. But if you are going to be wearing fast fashion, don't be afraid to rewear it. And hey, be creative. If you're going to rewear something, it doesn't have to look exactly the same as you wore it the last time. You can figure out a way to mix and match things so that it actually accomplishes the look that you want, even though you're wearing the same item. So I think, again, being strategic and buying things that will last you a long time and can get repeated wears through a capsule wardrobe is one way to really participate in fast fashion. And buying fast fashion does not make you a bad person. We are operating in systems that we cannot control, but if that is what you can afford, then definitely do your best to make it as wearable and as useful in a long-lasting way as best as you can.
Great tips in terms of 30 wears, making sure you love it, buying basics, and re-wearing. I mean, I totally can empathize with the wanting the new items for social media. I remember years ago when I was a correspondent on Entertainment Tonight Canada, and every time I would post my outfit for the show, everyone would be like, oh my gosh, fashion queen. And then it would make me think, okay, I need to be wearing all these cool looks to get more of this engagement and more of this validation. But then I realized I'm like, okay, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. So I'll just keep re-wearing the same stuff that I have. When it comes to people looking at their existing wardrobe, I know that it's really common for people to want to do the purge and the declutter a few times a year. But when you're looking at what you own, what are some questions that you should ask yourself when you're assessing your wardrobe?
Comfort is one. Like, I think sometimes we keep things that are really cute or really pretty, but we never wear them because they're completely uncomfortable. So I think it's really about like whether you're assessing your old closet or buying new things, comfort is a really key factor that will ensure that that garment is going to get as much wear as possible. And then I think fit, like, does it still fit you? Because clothes grow over time. So if something is really cool looking, but it doesn't fit you anymore, then realistically, some people, we keep it because, I'm going to lose that extra 5 pounds. I'm going to lose that extra 10 pounds. But again, fit and comfort, are those things going to be factor? Because if so, then maybe it's worth keeping it. But if not, maybe it's better that you toss it. And then, taking a page out of Marie Kondo's book, like, does it bring you joy or does it spark joy? If it still sparks joy to you, then it's probably worth keeping. But if not, maybe it's something that somebody else could find more useful. But I think the other thing is don't be afraid to look at new ways to reinvent the way the garment. So, you might have, as I said, like mix and match your clothes, mix and match the way you wear it. You might have worn it with pants, like you might have had a blouse that you typically wear with pants. Could you maybe see it being worn under a skirt or a dress? And just figuring out different combinations within your closet to create new styles. It helps you feel like you've got new clothes out of new ones or old ones.
I've heard somebody tell me that the most sustainable item that you can wear is the item that is already in your closet.
Exactly. Exactly.
And if one decides that they want to dispose of clothes that they don't wear anymore, that they don't love anymore, what are your tips for disposing in the most sustainable way that is possible right now?
I know that a lot of people tend to like to donate their clothes. One tip to donate is to make sure that the clothes that you're donating are actually in season, because if you donate when it's in season, it has a higher chance of it actually being bought and reused again. So if you're donating winter clothes during winter, that's going to be a lot more useful than obviously donating springtime clothes in the winter, because it's not in demand. So, and making sure that they come to the recycling facility or the secondhand clothing facility already washed and clean, because that will also make sure that it does end up on the retail floor instead of going into the landfill. If it has smells in it, you probably don't want to donate that. So instead, maybe there are some things that you would want to donate to or not donate, but to have in a recycling facility center. Depending on where you live, different cities and different countries have their own recycling systems. So you might want to check if there is a textile recycling facility near you, and if so, where the nearest drop off is. So instead of it just going into the trash, you can actually, send it off to an actual facility that specializes in recycling that textile so that it can go back into the production cycle or be remade into something else. And then, yeah, and I think if you can find a way to swap clothes with your friends and your family instead of just, throwing it away, that is another way to ensure that the clothes get reused and that it has a second life.
So many great tips for all of the fashion lovers, but the people who want to love the earth and also other people across the supply chain too. Ruby, thank you so much for chatting with me today. If people want to learn more about you and your work as a sustainable fashion storyteller, where can they follow you?
Well, it's very easy to find me. It's just my first and last name. My Instagram handle and my website is just Ruby Veridiano, rubyveridiano.com. So just look me up, and and I always respond to messages that I get. So if you have any further questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to go and play in my existing closet now.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the time to talk about wearing our values on our sleeve and just making sure that we're creating a stylish but still really positive planet.
Thank you. As someone who loves fashion, I learned so much in that conversation. So thank you, Ruby, for being part of the podcast this week. Now it's time for me to answer a listener question. And this question was submitted a long time ago, but I thought it was a good time to dig it up today. And the question is, how do you reinvent yourself? And I have reinvented myself a lot over the last few years. I was thinking, I am very close to the 3-year anniversary of when I quit my job before I went on Survivor and then embarked on this new adventure. So why not have a think about how I reinvented myself? And I will always preface this by saying that I am not a therapist, psychologist, psychotherapist, counselor. I am just speaking from my own personal experience. So take it with a massive pile of salt and speak to your own therapist, counselor, psychotherapist, or psychologist about your own personal situation. But if you want to hear from me how I do it, or at least how I did it, here it is. So number one, and I know that this is such a common piece of advice, but I'd say write a journal. And once you have a journal going, you'll be able to really understand how you feel and reflect about things. When I started journaling years ago, I had such a hard time being able to reflect on my feelings. So my journal truly started as me every day just writing a bulleted list of things that happened to me that day. So I would just say literally woke up, worked out, walked to work, had this meeting, did this after work. And it was just a very functional list of the things that I did. Because I think I just had to get into the habit of reflecting on my day. And then from there, then I started to write about how I felt about all of those things. And then now I just find that I go to journal before I go to bed at night, and just pages and pages of stuff come out. But try to start a journaling practice, because this is what helps a lot of people, myself included, to begin the process of self-reflection on a regular basis. My second tip is put yourself in new situations and meet new people. I think that it can get really easy to stay within our comfort zones and within the people and the things that we know. And there is certainly security and comfort in doing that. But if you're looking to push yourself and to learn more about yourself, I think it's always beneficial to put yourself in new situations. I'm not saying you need to sign up for, I don't know, a full-time program and then realize that that's not for you. And I mean, going back to school, but put yourself in new situations and then check in with yourself to see, do I like being here? Do I not like being here? Meet new people and decide whether or not you feel comfortable and safe with them, or think about qualities that you like in them or qualities in yourself that you like that come out when you're with them, and things that you might not like about how you feel when you're with that person. I think doing all of these new things and exposing yourself to new scenarios allows you to then check in with yourself to see what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And then you can start to do more things that feel good. Another tip is ask yourself questions and then ask yourself follow-up questions. So when you are journaling, when you are in these new experiences, meeting new people, ask yourself how you feel about these situations, and then ask yourself why, and then ask yourself another follow-up question, and get into the habit of asking yourself questions. I know that it can be really hard to do the self-reflections, and sometimes you don't want to ask yourself hard questions. But I think that getting into the habit of asking yourself questions allows you to start asking yourself the tougher and tougher questions. And then when you're able to be honest with yourself, when you are asking yourself hard questions, I think that those are where breakthroughs come through. And then after you have breakthroughs, you could potentially have more self-compassion and then allow yourself to grow and reinvent further. Again, not a psychologist. This is just speaking from my own experience and my own personal advice. So take it as you will. And then the last one is be willing to let go of older versions of yourself. This one is definitely a hard one, because it's so easy for people to believe that, oh, my identity was based on this, or my identity was based on my career, or this is the type of person I always thought that I was. And it's sad. There is some grief that comes with letting go of old versions of yourself, especially because through letting go of old versions of yourself, it might change the way that you interact with different people in your life, or certain relationships that you have might change. And it's scary when things change. I get it. But when you allow yourself to let go of old versions of yourself that might not serve you anymore, then you create more room for this new and more evolved version of yourself to come through. But I know it's sad, and there's probably also some grief because you feel bad that maybe this old version of yourself that you realize doesn't serve you anymore, you could also feel guilt that you held on to it for so long. So also have self-compassion if letting go of an older version of yourself is hard. But I know that all of that is easier said than done, but that in a nutshell is my advice for reinventing yourself. And then, hey, if you want to do it in terms of fashion, as Ruby said, let's get started with our own closets and see what we can buy that's unique and potentially secondhand. So yeah, if you have more questions for me, whether it's to get to know me better or to ask me for advice, feel free to ask me in the comments or DM me through the podcast Instagram account. That is at Happy to See Me Pod. We are also on YouTube at Happy to See Me Pod. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and share this episode with somebody who you think might enjoy it. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast this week, and I will be happy to see you next Monday.